Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for A Time to Stand, which is episodes 1 of Season 6 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win one of my latest user polls is the 6th season episode, Time to Stand. So, A Time to Stand is the episode that starts out the 6th season, that takes off where we left off from the 5th season cliffhanger, where the Dominion Cardassian Alliance took over the station, and it deals with Cisco and the Federation losing the war against the Dominion and having very low morale, where Cisco is giving a mission to destroy a Ketracel White Depot with a Jem'Hadar ship. Meanwhile, on the station, Odo and Kira have to deal with Dukat and Wayne running things and the Cardassians now being in charge. So, this episode, I think, I like it better in retrospect because I can see when this episode first came out, I was used to the format, and most people were used to the format of Star Trek having this cliffhanger finale and then the premiere resolved it. So the premiere was always like an epic conclusion, an epic battle, and this was not that. This was basically set up for the story arc to go, that they were stretching things out a bit more in order to get more out of the storyline instead of just resolving it right away like Star Trek typically would do. And so I think when this episode first came out, I remember reading a lot of reviews that did not like this, that were massively disappointed. I myself remember being a bit disappointed because I remember that the final scene of A Call to Arms, where they show the Klingon Federation Starfleet ships, like fleets of all these ships, like that's commonplace now. We become accustomed to it. We're used to it. Just in Deep Space Nine alone, we get scenes like, and Sacrifice of Angels, or the final episode, What You Leave Behind, with massive battles, and of course in the modern age, seeing these massive space battles. And Star Trek, be it the reboot movies or the Discovery or whatnot, is very commonplace. But back in the 90s when this first came out, this was very unheard of in Star Trek, because this is when like CGI effects and stuff were just starting to come into play. Because earlier, like in Next Gen, they'd use models, so we just have the Enterprise like sitting there, and then you have like a Klingon ship or two Klingon ships or Romulan ships, and they just sit there at each other and go pew 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 pew. And so you weren't used to seeing massive amounts of ships on the screen. So I remember when my mind was completely blown when I seen this. And as I said, this is when CGI effects were first coming into play. Now, some might say, oh, Babylon 5 started doing it earlier, but Babylon 5 CGI looked like video games. It was horrible. I'm sorry, but it was and does not hold up. Whereas the special effects here in Deep Space Nine do hold up because they waited a bit longer until the technology got a bit better. So I was expecting this episode to follow through on that huge, like, just to see the battles, because the whole story left it off implying there was going to be huge wars, huge battles, it's just beginning and all this. And instead we got this episode, which is, some might describe as wheel spinning. I would say is better described as setup, because it's more of just slowly establishing this new dynamic for what's going on with the Dominion War. And this, as I said, was not at all commonplace back in the 90s when this came out, particularly in Star Trek, so I could see why a lot of people were upset and disappointed, myself included, with this episode. But in retrospect, from a more modern perspective, this practice is a lot more common, particularly in shows like Game of Thrones, for example, because Game of Thrones always does this. Every year, the season premiere is kind of an understated, slow character building episode that just sets things up for the season to come, which is pretty much what this episode is. And then later on in this season, things start getting crazy. And yeah, and this, so in retrospect, this actually seems a lot more acceptable. It's a lot more commonplace, and so I did appreciate this episode a lot more. And I think it actually does a really good job of setting up for what's going to happen in particularly the Dominion takeover of the station story arc. But that being said, I do have a couple of huge complaints about this episode, a couple of huge nitpicks that really, really bother me. Now, let me get into the first one, which is the biggest one, which I'm pretty sure I talked about a lot in other videos before, but it's very relevant here. I mean, you could argue that it's more of a complaint of a call to arms, but I think it actually really does take effect or impact this episode in particular a lot. And that's the thing when in the call to arms, Cisco set up this minefield to stop the Dominion from sending reinforcements because he could see that the Dominion would keep sending shitloads and craploads of reinforcements, and he knew it was going to get to the point where they were going to be able to overwhelm Starfleet without a real fight. So he needed to put a stop to it before it got to that point. So he put up the minefield, and as soon as that happened, Wayne and Ducat came along. It's like, well, if you don't take it down, we're just going to take the station from you and remove it ourselves. And so this was a huge gauntlet, because if they took down that minefield, that means they could send in as many reinforcements as they like and basically overwhelm the Federation, which is exactly why Cisco put up the minefield in the first place. So the stakes are high. So Kira rightfully asked how many ships are Starfleet sending to help us defend Deep Space Nine, and Cisco says none. So, and at the end of the episode, the reason we're given on why not only Starfleet but also the Klingons didn't send any ships to defend Deep Space Nine and this wormhole, the minefield, the wormhole that was protecting the entire Alpha Quadrant from an unlimited amount of reinforcements from the Dominion coming in. So basically, it was the threshold of win or lose. And the reason we're given on why Starfleet didn't send any ships, none whatsoever, was because they were busy doing these attacks on these shipyards, these Dominion shipyards. Well, in this episode, we find out that those attacks on those Dominion shipyards equated to exactly jack shit. They meant nothing. They're not even referenced. They're not even mentioned. This episode begins, we're saying that the Starfleet and the Klingons are losing the war. And it shows like O'Brien's talking about, oh, we're sending this huge fleet to this battle. We're going to have a win because we need one. And only 14 ships survive out of 112 ships. And it's a massive defeat. And they just keep losing and losing and losing. In fact, Bashir even projects that the Starfleet is going to lose the war in a certain amount of time, and there's only a 32% chance that they're even going to survive. And so that completely goes against everything that a Call to Arms established, because especially the tone, the theme, because the Call to Arms end with this massive Starfleet and Klingon fleet of ships, like da, 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 ready to battle, and they're suggesting there's going to be this huge battle. But then this episode begins with sort of an homage to the exact same shot with the Starfleet and Klingon fleets, but shows them damaged and wrecked, and ships are being dragged by tractor beam, and they're all like battle damaged to show that they're completely fucked. And not only do I think that goes against the heart and the tone of what a Call to Arms established, it makes no fucking sense why Starfleet didn't send any ships to defend Deep Space Nine. Okay, so in strategic terms, anyone who knows anything about strategy, if you're in a battle situation or in a war and you have a piece of property or piece of real estate that is a make or break, that if you lose the war, if you lose that one piece of property, you lose that position, then you lost the entire war. Then there's an instant lose. In fact, I would argue in real life, there was never actually been a situation where that's more true than it is in this fictional scenario, where the wormhole is basically the gateway to infinite amount of reinforcements from the enemy. So, but even in any situation where you do have a strategically vital, not just important, but vital, like if you lose that position, you lose the war, naturally, you're going to put everything that you have to make sure that that position is so reinforced that if the enemy were to attack and try to take it, it would be a very costly position for them. So costly that they would not even consider doing it, because one, they would probably fail, and two, even if they didn't, their losses would be so extreme that it would totally diminish the attempt of doing so. Now, of course, this situation sets up a different scenario, because if the Dominion did take this position, it would promise them infinite amount of reinforcements, so it wouldn't matter how much damage they took taking it. But I mean, also it took them over 3 months to take down the minefields. So if Starfleet and the Klingons put everything they had into protecting DS9, and Dominion tried to take it anyway, but they would lost so much that they would have to wait 3 months for more reinforcements, and in that time Starfleet could come in and take down the rest of what they had, because they used too much taking it. That would be the strategically smart thing to do. Send every fucking thing you have, basically, to protect that one point of real estate, to make the expenditure of trying to take it so costly that they wouldn't do it. But not only did they not do that, not only did they not send everything they had, they sent nothing. They sent nothing, no ships at all. They just had the Defiant and the one Klingon ship, and the station has its own defenses, of course, but that's all they had to protect the most vital. It's not even, I was going to say arguably, but it's not even arguably. It is indisputably the most vital position of the entire star, like the Alpha Quadrant. If that position is lost, then there's no more Federation, there's no more Klingon Empire, there's the Dominion Empire. They control the entire Alpha Quadrant. Dominion has dominion over the entire Alpha Quadrant instantly if they lose that one position. Well, not instantly, it did take them 3 months, but still, once they take down that minefield, instantly. And and they said nothing, and that is one of the biggest plot holes in the entire show, in my opinion. Not just this Dominion story arc or the entire show. I don't think there's ever been a plot hole as big as that one, and yeah, it does really bother me. Now, as for the whole, the Federation's fucked and Starfleet's fucked, as I said, that is not the impression A Call to Arms left us. And I can see why they changed this, why they did it this way from a storytelling perspective. In fact, the issue is I can see all too clearly why they did it. Because anyone who knows anything about story structure, or fiction writing, or whatever, with a 3-act structure, is the most common phrase is you have a 3-act structure. Act 1 is the introduction, Act 2 is the bulk of the story, and Act 3 is the conclusion. In Act 2, especially towards the end of Act 2, it's a very common saying that you put your protagonist in an impossible situation, and in Act 3 you get them out of the situation. I think the common saying is you put your hero up a tree, in Act 3 you figure a way to get them down from the tree. There's other ways of saying, some sayings that you put your protagonist through a hell that they think there's no escape from, and in Act 3 they actually find that escape. And so this story is obviously too obvious, if you ask me, following that same structure of making this impossible situation, and oh my god, Starfleet's so fucked, we're gonna lose the war, we just lost 100 ships, we're so fucked, and so it makes it more powerful in Sacrifice of Angels when Starfleet gets a huge win. But the problem is it's too contrived. It's too obvious. I think, like, if you ever watch the show Stargate, SG-1 and Atlantis both had this issue where they always had to have this impossible, like the Goa'uld or the Wraith or whatever. Oh, they rule everything where it's impossible. And then once that threat was gone, oh, here's another threat, the Ori. It's like they always have to put the galaxy so in an impossible situation that everyone's fucked. And I think that show relied too much on that trope as well. And as I said, like, there's nothing wrong with... There's a reason why that 3-act structure and having put your protagonist in the worst situations possible. There's a reason why that is a commonly used method. There's a reason why that exists, because it works. A lot of, like, you look at the Star Wars trilogy, The Empire Strikes Back, ends in a very dark tone because that's the second movie of the trilogy, and that works. So I'm not knocking the structure itself, because there's a reason why it's often used, because it does work. But, like the Star Wars trilogy is an example of it being used correctly, being used wisely. This is an example of it being used poorly, because it comes off as contrived. It's because if this method is used correctly, the audience will not be that conscious or aware of the fact that this method is being used, because it's so natural to the story and it's so natural to the characters, and it works so well to further the character stories and to further the plot that the audience doesn't even consider that there's a structure behind it, because we're so caught up in the story. But if it's used poorly, then it becomes all too obvious that this is a writing structure, a writing, cheat, as they say, to try to manipulate our emotions. And that's pretty much true of any bad writing, that it becomes too apparent that the writers are trying to manipulate us to a certain thing. Like, people say writing is all about trying to manipulate your audience's emotions. That's true. But good writing, this will not be apparent. This will not be so to the forefront of the audience's minds. And here, I think it is apparent. It's beyond apparent, because it is inconsistent what they established, and it is so contrived. It comes off as it's obvious that, we want to put our people in the bad situation, so let's just make things so horrible that the Starfleet's losing, even though it doesn't make any sense. Because if the Dominion already had enough to, like, Paul calls this big of a threat to make it so Starfleet could barely win the war, then why did they wait this long to attack? And why did Sisko wait that long to set up the minefield in the first place? And it's inconsistent with the what was established in the Call to Arms, which more are presented a situation where we're evenly matched. So, like, here's the Starfleet Klingon ship that destroyed these shipyards. We're going to war, and that's why Sisko started the war. Like, in that, because they make it a bit unclear. They mention, like, in the Pale Moonlight that Sisko started the war with Dominion, and in the Call to Arms, it seemed like the smart thing to do, because they kept sending these reinforcements, and they needed to be preemptively stopped, otherwise they would be overwhelmed. But in this episode, it seems like starting a war was an idiotic move, because now the Starfleet's overwhelmed, whereas that's not how it was presented in the Call to Arms. It was presented like, we destroyed these shipyards, we had this huge fleet, we're ready to go to battle, and we're going to have an evenly matched fight. And I think it would have been harder for the writers to stay true to that theme and have an evenly matched fight. But I think it could have been done. I think it definitely would have taken more effort on the writer's part to make that just as exciting and intense. But it could have definitely been done. Falling back to we're all fucked, we're all gonna die, is a cheat. It's lazy writing. It's an easy out. It's like, how do we make this evenly matched battle really intense? Well, we can. I'm too lazy to do that. Let's just fall back to the easy out that they're all fucked and the Dominion is going to overwhelm them. That way, it's so impactful when they do defeat the Dominion in the end, or at least when they do take back Deep Space Nine. And yeah, don't get me wrong. if you know my opinion on the whole story arc of Dominion takeover, story arc of the station, I love it. I think it's the best thing Star Trek ever did, particularly to date. I think it was a huge improvement on the show. I think it's one of the best moments of the entire Star Trek franchise. But this one aspect of it does irk me, and I wish they would have handled it a bit better, and I think they could have. Anyway, the rest of, the actual... Alright, another huge complaint. I know I just keep complaining, but another huge complaint I have about the storyline is the whole Catch Yourself White thing, particularly watching this episode in retrospect. Because this episode, and a lot of episodes during this Dominion takeover story arc, try to, emphasize the Catch Yourself White as the Achilles heel of the Dominion. And it makes sense that it would be, because the Jem'Hadar, their greatest warriors, are dependent on this drug that can only be manufactured in the Gamma Quadrant, which they're now completely cut off from. And they're all going to die. And so this is rightfully brought up several times throughout the story arc. And yet, it is, after the story arc is over, it's so easily hand-waved away. It really annoys me. Now, this, again, has more to do with that statistical probability episode with Bashir and his genetically engineered buddies, which I never really cared for that. It's not a bad episode, but I don't really care for it that much. And part of what bothered me about that episode is some of the reasoning that they had of why the Dominion... Again, this is falling back to the cheat. Even after they took back DS9, the Dominion's definitely going to win. We're all fucked. And that annoyed me. But in that episode, Wayne and Damar are negotiating with Cisco, and they're seemingly to give up a lot. And all they want in return is this insignificant, solar system. And then Bashir reveals that it's because they can they have the resources on that system to reproduce Catch Yourself White. And that makes a lot of sense. So I'm with that. What I'm not with is that Bashir suggests to Cisco that he just let them have it because there's no way they can stop them from getting it. I don't remember exactly what his reasoning was. I think there's no way we can stop them from getting White, or something along the lines of, if they don't have White, then Jem'Hadar will go kill crazy and kill everyone, and here's the casualties that we'll get if the Jem'Hadar go crazy, so you have to prevent that from happening. Which is nonsense. It goes against everything that was established in this story arc, especially this episode in particular, where Admiral Ross is like, we need to cut off the Dominion from their supply of Catch Yourself White, because if the Jem'Hadar don't have Catch Yourself White, they die. We win the war. End of story. And that's the stakes that was driven in this episode. But then the fucking genetically engineered bullshit just hand waves that away by saying, actually, we need to prevent that. No, actually, bullshit. What you need to do is, when you know the Jem'Hadar are going to run out of Catch Yourself White, is buff up your defenses to the teeth. Buff up your defenses as much as you possibly can to minimize the amount of damage. And, by the way, the Jem'Hadar, when they go kill crazy for not having Catch Yourself White, they're not just going to kill Federation, Starfleet, and Klingons. They're going to kill everyone, including themselves. So another thing that you could smartly do is try to redirect their anger towards each other, so they're destroying themselves and not Starfleet. But yes, you will suffer a lot of casualties. Yes, it will be bloody, but guess what? After that's over, and if you prepared for it well enough, you will survive, and Starfleet will survive strong. Then the war's over. You won. Yay! War is over. That is the clearest way to win the war. And yet, they're like, oh no, we can't just let them have the Catch Yourself White. Bullshit. See, that, again, this is probably more of an issue with that episode, but I've already reviewed it and I didn't talk about this. But that is, again, a plot contrivance in order to keep the war storyline going. Because the writers realize that is too easy of an out for Starfleet to win the Dominion War, so they can't make it that easy for them. They have to make it harder, which, to be clear, I'm with. I agree with. Absolutely. That would be too easy of a way for Starfleet to win the Dominion War. But they needed to come up with a better reasoning to escape. I mean, it's kind of insincere to rely on it during this episode and during the story arc of, oh, Catcher Cell White is our easy win, and then all of a sudden just hand wave it away like it means nothing. And do it in the way that you try to make the audience even forget about it. Very disingenuous, and it does, I think, retroactively damage this episode, which is why I bring it up. Because watching this episode now and seeing it, because it's all about Sisko destroying the Catcher Cell White Depot, and they make such a big deal about how this is a huge... It ends up being just like the fucking shipyards. It ends up meaning nothing. And which that really irritates me, especially because this whole story arc is meant to be looked at as a whole. In fact, you're meant to take in the last 2 seasons of DS9 as a whole and not just simple episodic. And so for them to be so inconsistent within this wide-spanning story is really annoying to me. But... That being said, if you take... Those are huge complaints I have, but if you take those away, the Sisko storyline is not that bad. I mean, it's not actively good, but it's not horrible. But the real strength of this episode is definitely the Deep Space Nine storyline, which I actually think is amazing. I think it is really good setup. I think I did take this for granted the first time I saw it, because watching it in retrospect, it does do an amazing job of setting up the Dominion story arc and how things will go. Particularly because it shows close up how hopeless the situation is for Odo and Kira in particular, and how they have to live on a station that's taken over run by Cardassians and the Dominion, and they're in such a desperate state that Kira has to think of Weyoun as an ally, because he's the only one holding back another Cardassian occupation of Bajor, basically, because Dukat and especially Damar make it clear that they just want to occupy Bajor again. But Weyoun is preventing them from doing that because the Dominion have a non-aggression pact with Bajor. Now, I think I've heard the argument made that, oh, do the Dominion really care about the non-aggression pact with Bajor? They're such a minor, alien species that their technology is so primitive that they couldn't even be an annoying insect compared to the Dominion. But I think they're forgetting about what this episode brings up, Kira in particular brings up, and I think it totally sells it for me, is that it's not about the Bajorans in particular. It's about proving to the rest of the Alpha Quadrant, all the other species, not just the Romulans. I think there's Tholians and Zinkethi. I think some other species are mentioned to have non-aggression pacts with the Dominion who do pose a significant threat to the Dominion, as we actually see later on that the Romulans could in fact shift the whole tide of war. And so they need to prove to them that are important that, hey, we do uphold our treaties. Because if they just reneged on their treaty with Bajor for the fuck of it, then that would make the Romulans and some of these more powerful species like the Zenkethi more uneasy and unwilling to trust the Dominion. So by the Dominion proving that they can uphold their treaties, they're proving that that helps them stabilize their situation in the entire quadrant. So the Bajorans specifically make no difference. That doesn't matter. It's just a symbol to all the other species, and I totally buy that. I think that makes 100% sense, and I love how that comes to that sets up a dynamic where Weyoun is kind of an ally, but at the same time he's part of the Dominion, which is trying to actively take over the Alpha Quadrant and kill all their friends. So it sets up such a complex scenario, which I absolutely love. And I love how, Kira tries to convince him to take Bajoran security forces back on, and Dukat's like, no, and Weyoun goes along with it. But she eventually convinced Odo to ask Wayne. At first, he doesn't want to because he's very uncomfortable with the fact that he thinks he's a god, which I think is a good characteristic. But Kira goes to him and makes the argument, look, that gives you power. The fact that he thinks you are a god gives you power. But what good is power if you're not willing to use it? So she talks him into it, and he goes there, and he's just, I want my Bajoran security forces back. And he's just like, done. And Dukat tries to argue. He's like, shut up, Dukat, this doesn't involve you. Like, that was absolutely great. And it did show, like, point blank, the kind of power Wayne had. But, and on the other hand, this is why it's such great setup, is that Wayne asked for something in return, and that's for Odo to join the Security Council. Which again Odo is very uncomfortable with, but Kira and him say, they come to the decision that again it's an opportunity they can't pass by. But this is the beginning of Odo's manipulation to when he eventually turns on the Federation. And again, this is such a beautiful setup, because this episode makes it clear that Odo and Kira's biggest strength, they're in such a dark situation in this occupation, but their biggest strength, their biggest light of hope is each other, and their friendship and their commitment to help each other. You see where I'm going with this? The episode I just reviewed a couple days ago, or a couple weeks ago, where Odo betrays Kira. That's why this is such a beautiful setup for that episode, or for that story arc, and how, because it attacks the one strength, the one light of hope that they have is their faith in each other, and how that's put to the test, and how the Dominion is purposely, because the founders want Odo back, they purposely want to attack that bond that Kira and Odo had. So it was just so well done. It was just such beautiful setup for that. And also, God, what I really love about this is the dynamic it shows with Dukat. I think this story arc in this episode in particular is one of the best uses of Dukat in the entire show, because it shows how egotistical and power hungry he is. Because, I'd actually never been a fan previously of his whole crush on Kira, whatever, but I thought it was used so well, because it made so much sense, because it showed him wanting power over her. He's not in love with Kira. That's why I call it like an infatuation or a crush or desire. It's not love. He wants to rule over her, and that's made clear in that scene where he's like calls her into his office and it's like coming on to her, and she's just like, what the fuck do you expect to happen here? Do you expect me to just be in some kind of intimate relationship with you? And he touches her face and he says, oh, but we already are in one, we already have one, and she just knocks his hand away, and like, that was so intense, because that showed how much he loved being in this position of power over her, how much he loved having the station back, and how much he was exercising that, and he wanted to make it clear to her that she had no choice, that he would possess her no matter what. And that's kind of egotistical fuckhead villain that makes this character like so powerful and such a great villain. And I love, and this is even played on later in the arc in Sons and Daughters, where Kira actually starts, because Dukat tries to get to her by using the relationship that she has with his daughter, because that's the connection that they share. So he tries to manipulate that to get to her, and it starts to work, and she starts to realize this, and she becomes aware of the fact that he's starting to get to her, and she's like, what the fuck am I doing? And like takes his dress that he sent her and just like, ugh. And I love that. Again, this was such beautiful setup. Like, it's funny because some things were just so ill handled in the Faithful Long-Term story arcs, like the whole the whole thing with the shipyards or whatever in A Catcher So White. But this, the character moments, the character beats, this part, especially the DS9, the whole thing, this was all lined up beautifully. Like, I don't know whether or not they had actually planned it, or they just, but it doesn't matter. if they actually planned it out or if they just worked off of the setup they had. Either way, they did such a great job with this aspect of it. So I guess I should talk a little bit about Jake. You get the scene where Cisco has to tell his father that he left Jake behind. That was a good scene. I liked that. And you had the Jake going to Aoun, and he's refusing to send out any of his transmissions, which makes a lot of sense. Why would he? And the conversation that he and Jake have, I actually really like, but especially the way Wayne says when Jake asks him about what about freedom of the press, and Wayne is like, "Don't tell me you're that naive." Like, I love that because for one, it shows the kind of dictatorship and totalitarian regime the Dominion are, and but for another, it just shows the kind of power they have. But the one downside I would say about that is kind of defeats the whole point of Jake staying behind. It seems, again, I think the whole Jake staying behind was a bit of a contrivance, because if he didn't stay behind, then they would have no way to keep him on the show, because he wouldn't be in the Starfleet ship in a time of war, because he's not in Starfleet. So they had to keep him in the station in order to keep him relevant, and I think he barely becomes relevant. So that's all. But I've had main complaints about them trying to make Jake relevant overall, which has always been a struggle for them. I honestly think he shouldn't have been a main cast member. He should have been a supporting character, and that just appeared every now and then, like Keiko or someone. But whatever. That's just my opinion. Anyway, my rating for Time to Stand out of 10 is a 7. Very good. I think the Deep Space Nine aspect of the story of this episode was very strong. It was excellent setup. It's exactly the kind of thing you need to do these long-term story arcs, and it was such great character building. Like, it showed the kind of despicable person Dukat was. It showed the exact how desperate the situation for Kira and Odo was. It worked very well. Now, the Starfleet stuff was okay. Like, I obviously don't think it was as good, but it wasn't terrible. So you get some great moments, like Cisco talking to his father about how he left Jake behind, and it was the storyline with the Catch Yourself White and them using the view screens was adequately suspenseful, but there's a lot of fucking plot holes and plot contrivances involved with the Starfleet losing the war that really annoyed me. But it's not enough to say that this is a bad episode, because this is still a good episode, but it is enough to keep it from getting a score higher than the 7, though. So, but that Deep Space Nine storyline of it was just amazing. Anyway, that is it for my review of A Time to Stand. I will be back with more Star Trek episode reviews and other Star Trek videos, so be sure to check out my channel as I do many more videos on other shows like Lost, The Expanse, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.